What hasn't been depressing, though, is the box office for Thunderbolts, because my goodness, it did pretty well out of the gate.
Yeah,
It
did pretty
did
good.
$74 million domestically. It's already done $160 million worldwide. And by all accounts, comparatively to other Marvel movies, that is admittedly on the lower end of the spectrum. However, I don't know if in the year of our Lord 2025, as I just noted, if we should be comparing this to other Marvel movies.
Oh, it's
Because
different.
this weekend a year ago, we all collectively freaked out and we all wondered if cinema was dead.
Oh, it's not dead. It's
If the
certainly
movies
not
were
dead.
even going to
There's
survive.
there's more to that story as to why cinema is not dead right now. And most of it does not revolve around Thunderbolts, although Thunderbolts is helping the conversation. But to your
Mhm.
point earlier about this still being on the lower end for most Marvel debuts. In fact, I think this was still slightly below Captain America Brave New World from earlier this year as far as its
Yeah.
opening box office was concerned, its opening weekend box office
Yeah.
specifically.
Yep.
The big difference here is that Thunderbolts didn't cost $700 million.
Exactly.
It's not a
Yeah.
cheap movie, but there's a little less budgetary restrictions to this one when compared to most of these others, we'll say.
Yeah, exactly. It did not cost $700 million to make. This is a film that doesn't have to make $1 billion to be profitable. However, and you know what will save cost, marketing cost that is?
Mhm.
Sebastian Stan, go out and change all the posters, please. You go out and
You know,
do it. That'll save us some money.
it will save money, but it also creates this kind of positive aura around the movie that the
Yeah.
cast is so like excited about this movie that
Yeah.
it clearly seems to suggest that they love the movie that they made, right?
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
anything, that should be positive word of mouth right there.
Yeah.
So, if anything, saving money on marketing costs while giving the film more proper marketing. I mean, that's
Yeah.
everyone wins, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as we noted, by MCU standards, maybe it's a little bit lower than
Mhm.
others in that family. However, $74 million, given the state of affairs, certainly nothing to scoff at. It's no sinners, but it's out of the gate doing very well. And here's
Mhm.
the other thing. I mean, it is a Thunderbolts movie.
Yeah.
It is a group of anti-heroes, misfit characters. It's not your Captain Americas, your Iron Mans, your Spider-Mans. It's going to have to do some work.
Yeah.
And if you listen to our review of Thunderbolts, which is available right now, go and check it out. We had a really fun and thorough conversation on the film. If you ask us, the film did do the work. But it's
Yeah.
not just us. The conversation, the discourse on this film was rapid fire over the weekend. I think many people understandably were reserved, not just because it features characters they may or may not be aware of. That's certainly part of
Mhm.
it,
Yeah.
but also the MCU factor. Marvel has been struggling over phases 4 and 5, and they need to do some work to get people back into the theaters. I think this film did do the work. The conversation did spark a lot of buzz. I think this
Mhm.
film is going to have legs.
I hope it
I think
does.
it'll
I
have more
really
legs,
do.
maybe even
Yeah.
than Brave New World
Oh, I think
did.
it will. I mean, primarily because I just think it's a better movie, and I think people
Well,
will
exactly. Yeah.
recognize that.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm not ready to say that Thunderbolts has just single-handedly saved the MCU. It's way too early to say those words, but it's clearly a step in the right direction. It's
Yes,
clearly where they need to be going.
it is 100%.
Mhm.
It's where they need to be going. And I think this will create even more buzz for Fantastic Four as that film comes out here in another 2 months. I believe that is the
Yeah.
end of July when that film comes out.
Mhm.
But they, for the first time in a long time, especially on the film side, they've had a big win here. A
Yeah.
big win. Now, I know people might point to some of the television work. Daredevil Born Again, I thought was okay. I like Daredevil Born Again. I'm not as high on it as some others are.
Okay.
But I thought Daredevil Born Again was fine.
That's right. We still have
How
Ironheart coming out, don't we?
we still have Ironheart coming out. Yes, we
I
do.
forgot about that.
I know it's crazy.
I think Marvel forgot about that one too.
I know. Um, on the film side of things, though, I guess you could point back to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And I'm talking in terms of quality. I guess you could talk about Deadpool and Wolverine. That film obviously did very well financially,
It
but
was
I
a
don't
hit. Yeah.
know if it moved the needle as far as our collective consensus on the MCU.
Let's just say this. The doubters of the MCU, Deadpool and Wolverine didn't win them over. Now,
No,
Thunderbolts, I think, is more likely to
more
win those
likely to.
doubters over.
I
Yeah.
agree. Totally agree with that. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, I think collectively a lot of people really liked. And, but that film also came out at it was right off the heels of Quantumania, which was not good at
There was
all.
nowhere to go but up with that movie.
And Phase 4, most people were kind of meh on. You
Yeah.
and I might be a little higher than a lot of other people, but when you're talking about the general audience, most people didn't love Phase 4. And then
Yeah.
you tack along Quantumania to kick off Phase 5, and people are just like, I don't know. So Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is certainly a breath of fresh air at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But Guardians 3, now Thunderbolts, is that enough to move people in the right direction? I guess we'll see. We'll see what happens as we get to Fantastic Four. But I do think the big difference is obviously the direction of the MCU. When Guardians 3 came out, there was still uncertainty with Jonathan Majors. Are they going to stick with Kang? Are we going in a new direction?
Yeah.
So the MCU was still rudderless at that time.
And even at that point, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 kind of felt like an outlier in the extended universe in a way. And the Guardians trilogy really does in totality in many ways. I would argue that's really the only true trilogy of the MCU. The Captain America movies, there's 3 of them. I don't think that's a trilogy because they're too dependent on the other movies in between them. It's really more like 3 Captain America movies in an overarching franchise. But the Guardians movies felt very much like their own thing while still feeding into the broader thing. And in a way, I think
Fair.
that's what Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 kind of was. So it may not have won people over because it felt like it still kind of existed in its own creative bubble.
In its own little vacuum. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally
and
fair.
and that's how James Gunn operates. But that was kind of refreshing about it. I think Marvel at least
Yeah.
acknowledges they need those one-offs every now and then that kind of feed into their own separate thing as
Yeah,
opposed to just the grand scope of it all.
And perhaps the irony of that, as we talked about in our review, Thunderbolts, a lot of that same idea is applicable to Thunderbolts. Now, of course, there is some larger MCU context that is helpful. If you've seen Ant-Man and the Wasp, Falcon and Winter Soldier, if you want to include Bucky, his inclusion in the MCU films and Avengers and all that sort of stuff, that is helpful. But generally, Thunderbolts is a film that wants to function on its own terms. And it does so quite wonderfully, if you ask us.
There's a big difference between binge watching a TV series and then just watching a movie on its own terms that doesn't treat the surrounding films around it as homework. And Thunderbolts is very much the latter.
I agree. And that's what gives me hope for Fantastic Four, because until we get to the ending and we see what happens to that world, it is a film that is going to function in the multiverse on its own planet with its own storyline.
Yeah.
It probably won't be until the end of that film, the very end of the film, where it starts to connect the dots. Especially if you've seen Thunderbolts in the post-credit scene that we see there. So,
we talked about this with Thunderbolts. It's very much pulling inspiration from the first Avengers, Joss Whedon's film from 2012. The framework of it, the narrative flow of it, there are very literal plot parallels that mean opposite things, but it's very much calling attention to that. Fantastic Four First Steps is probably going to be the same thing, but for Captain America, the First Avenger. It's probably going to feel like even the retro vibes are kind of similar. And then that's a film that all of a sudden by the end became a direct tie-in to the Avengers.
To the Avengers, exactly.
That's what I think Fantastic Four is going to do.
Wholeheartedly agree. I think that is a great comp. That is almost, I would say that's exactly what we're going to see. I would almost say exactly that's how that film is going to play out. And I can't wait for that. So we'll see how that moves the needle with the MCU. I do think Thunderbolts will start to move the needle. I think it is getting people more excited. I haven't seen this kind of discourse on the positive end of the spectrum for the MCU in quite a long time. The people that did go and see it, they loved it. There was a lot of praise, a lot of buzz for the film. So I am glad to see that it is doing well to begin. 160, and especially, I cannot emphasize enough, this time last year, it was bleak. It was real bleak. And the rest of May did not get any better. I do think this year that's going to be very different. I think Final Destination Bloodlines is going to do well. Mission Impossible is obviously going to do well. So this May, I think there's a lot to look forward to. It's going to be different than last May, but just to see with my own eyes, theaters aren't dead.
Movies still exist.
It still exists.